Elliot Grant, one of the wealthiest men in New York City, stood before his towering mansion, a sprawling estate that reeked of wealth and power. Its polished stone facade reflected the sunlight, and the meticulously manicured lawns stretched endlessly. Servants scurried around, tending to every whim of the household. But today, something unusual was happening. Elliot, with his sleek suits and confident stride, was unrecognizable. He wore a tattered jacket, faded jeans smeared with dirt, and a floppy hat that hid most of his face. A long, scruffy beard completed the transformation. In his hand, he held a sign that read, "Hungry and homeless. Anything helps." "Are you sure about this, sir?" his loyal butler, James, asked hesitantly, holding out a walking stick to complete the disguise. "Absolutely," Elliot said with a wry smile. "It's an experiment. I've always wondered how people treat someone they think is beneath them. Besides, I want to know if my success has blinded me to the realities of the world. What happens when a billionaire disguises himself as a homeless man outside his own mansion?" Elliot Grant's bold social experiment reveals the shocking truth about human nature, exposing indifference, kindness, and betrayal in ways he never expected. But the twist at the end? It will leave you speechless. Stay tuned for a story that will change how you see the world. Reluctantly, James nodded. Elliot's wealth had been amassed through ruthless ambition in the business world, but even he felt a gnawing emptiness lately. Over the years, he had grown isolated, cocooned in a world of luxury, shielded from the struggles of everyday people. He wanted to experience life from a different perspective. Elliot sat on the sidewalk, just beyond the wrought iron gates of his mansion. The neighborhood buzzed with the presence of the elite, business tycoons, celebrities, and heirs to fortunes. None would recognize him in this state, or so he thought. The experiment had begun. The first hour passed slowly. Elliot's back ached from sitting on the pavement, and his throat dried as he quietly called out, "Spare some change?" Cars drove past without slowing, their windows tinted to shield the wealthy occupants inside. Joggers avoided his gaze, their expensive sneakers slapping against the pavement as they hurried by. The morning was brisk, but the chill of the air was nothing compared to the coldness of the people around him. Elliot was startled when a woman in a designer dress glared at him. Her heavily bejeweled hand clutched her pearls, as though his presence threatened her safety. "You shouldn't be here," she snapped, her tone dripping with disdain. "This is a respectable neighborhood." Elliot kept his head low, muttering an apology. She didn't bother to respond and marched away, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. By midday, hunger gnawed at his stomach. The breakfast he had skipped now felt like a distant memory. A man in a crisp suit finally stopped and dropped a few coins into his cup, but didn't spare him a second glance. Most people walked past without acknowledging his presence, their eyes sliding over him as though he didn't exist. Elliot felt a twinge of something unfamiliar. Vulnerability. Sitting on the ground, surrounded by apathy, he began to wonder, is this how they always feel? He watched another car speed by, its driver's face obscured by sunglasses. For the first time, he felt truly invisible. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the street, Elliot began to lose hope that anyone would treat him with genuine compassion. The air grew cooler, and the ache in his back deepened. Just as he was about to call it a day, a small voice broke through his thoughts. "Are you okay, mister?" Looking up, he saw a young girl with messy pigtails clutching a stuffed bunny. Her wide, innocent eyes were filled with concern. Behind her, a tired-looking woman in a nurse's uniform stood, holding a bag of groceries. The woman's face was lined with exhaustion, but her gaze was warm. "We don't have much, but you can take this," the mother said, pulling a sandwich from her bag and handing it to him. Her kindness was palpable, her smile genuine. Elliot was taken aback. He stared at the sandwich for a moment before accepting it with trembling hands. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking. The woman nodded, and with a gentle tug on her daughter's hand, she turned to leave. As they disappeared down the street, Elliot felt a lump rise in his throat. It was the first act of kindness he had received all day, and it had come from someone who seemed to have so little to give. He watched them go, the child skipping happily, oblivious to the weight of her mother's sacrifices. The next day, Elliot returned to his spot, determined to delve deeper into the experiment. The ache in his back had become a constant companion, and the cool morning air bit at his skin. This time he noticed two of his business associates exiting a nearby coffee shop. Mark and Sarah, both executives in his company, were laughing as they walked toward their cars. Elliot raised his cup, lowering his head to avoid recognition. "Spare some change?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark stopped mid-stride, squinting at him. "Hey, Sarah, doesn't he look familiar?" he asked, tilting his head. His tone was laced with amusement rather than concern. Sarah glanced at Elliot, then burst into laughter. "Oh, please, he's just another bum. There's no way someone we know would end up like this." Elliot's stomach churned. These were people he had trusted, employees who owed their success to his leadership. Yet here they were, dismissing him with a wave of indifference. Mark chuckled, pulling a coin from his pocket. He tossed it at Elliot's feet, the small metal disc clinking against the pavement. "Get yourself a meal, buddy," he said with a smirk before walking away. Elliot's hands trembled as he picked up the coin. Rage bubbled inside him, but he swallowed it down. The experiment was revealing more than he had anticipated. He felt a sharp pang of disappointment, not just in them, but in the world he had helped create. On the third day, Elliot was preparing to pack up when an older man approached. His appearance was as weathered as the pavement he walked on. Scruffy and thin, with calloused hands and a weathered face that told a story of hardship. "Mind if I sit?" the man asked, gesturing to the space beside Elliot. Elliot nodded. "Go ahead," he said, moving his sign to make room. The man introduced himself as Sam, a former construction worker who had lost everything after an injury. "Nobody's hiring someone like me anymore," Sam explained, his voice tinged with bitterness. "You'd think after building half this city, someone would care, but they don't." The two talked for hours, sharing stories about life and loss. Sam's resilience moved Elliot deeply. Despite his circumstances, Sam still managed to find humor in the small things and spoke with a sense of pride about the work he had done. "You're a good listener," Sam said with a grin. "Most folks don't give us the time of day. They look right through us." Elliot smiled faintly. "Maybe they should," he replied, his words heavy with meaning. For the first time, he felt like he was truly seeing the world through someone else's eyes. As he sat on the sidewalk that Friday, a sleek black car pulled up. The doors opened, and James stepped out, looking tense. "Sir, it's time," James said, glancing around nervously as if the situation might attract unwanted attention. Before Elliot could respond, Mark and Sarah appeared, accompanied by several other high-ranking employees. They stared at him, their faces a mix of shock and embarrassment. "Mr. Grant?" Sarah stammered, her face pale. "What are you doing here?" Elliot stood slowly, brushing dirt off his clothes. The transformation from beggar to powerful CEO was almost theatrical. "I could ask you the same thing," he said coldly. "Do you always treat people in need with such disdain?" Mark stammered, his confident demeanor evaporating. We didn't know it was you." "That's exactly the problem," Elliot replied, his voice steady but filled with disappointment. "You shouldn't treat anyone the way you treated me, regardless of who they are." Elliot invited Sam to the mansion that evening. Dressed in clean clothes provided by James, Sam marveled at the opulence around him. The grand halls, adorned with priceless art and chandeliers, seemed like a different world. "I've got a proposition for you," Elliot said over dinner, his tone earnest. "How would you like to manage a new initiative to support people in situations like yours? Housing, jobs, training, the works." Sam blinked in disbelief. His fork paused midair. "Are you serious?" Sam asked, his voice filled with both hope and doubt. "Dead serious," Elliot said, leaning forward. "You've got the first-hand experience and insight I lack. You know what's truly needed out there. I can provide the resources, but I need someone who understands the reality to lead the charge." Sam's eyes glistened with emotion. "I never thought I'd get a second chance, let alone one like this." Elliot smiled warmly. "Everyone deserves a second chance. And it's time for me to start giving back in a meaningful way." Word of Elliot's experiment quickly spread among his employees and throughout the city. The reactions ranged from awe to embarrassment for those who had failed his unwitting test. Mark and Sarah resigned in shame, unable to face the fallout. Others reflected deeply on their own attitudes and vowed to change. The initiative, named the Bridge Project, soon became a beacon of hope. Sam, now its director, worked tirelessly to provide resources and opportunities to those in need. Under his leadership, abandoned buildings were transformed into shelters, and job training programs flourished. Elliot, for his part, continued to visit the streets, not as a beggar, but as a philanthropist determined to stay connected to the people he was helping. As Elliot watched the first group of graduates from the job training program celebrate their new positions, he felt something he hadn't in years: fulfillment. His experiment had not only opened his eyes, but had set him on a path of true purpose. And so the man who once sat on the sidewalk, ignored and invisible, became a symbol of hope for an entire city. Elliot's experiment wasn't just a test of others, it became a revelation about himself and the world he had helped shape. His journey reminds us that true wealth isn't measured by money, but by the impact we have on others. Kindness, compassion, and understanding have the power to bridge divides and change lives. Let this story inspire us all to look beyond appearances and treat every person with dignity, because the smallest act of kindness can create the biggest ripple.